Welcome to the Mechanical PE Exam Prep Podcast, the podcast where I give mechanical engineers like you the tools and motivation to get your professional engineering license and take your career to the next level. In this episode, I talk to professional engineer Brett Screechfield about his experience preparing for and passing the HVAC and Refrigeration PE exam on the first try. Brett's success story gets to the heart of why it is often difficult to know if or when you're actually ready to take the PE exam. His final takeaways are absolute gems for anyone going through the PE exam study process. So with that, here's my chat with Brett. So let's start at the beginning. Take us to when you decided you wanted to go for your PE, and how did you come to that decision, and what were kind of some of your initial thoughts about going to that goal?
Yeah, for my line of work, the PE has kind of been the logical stepping stone for advancing in contractor work, for uh, stamping projects, for stamping work. So professional license is kind of important for becoming a either project manager or I guess before that for a like lead mechanical engineer to actually organize a team, right? You can have the leadership skills, but for actually stamping the work, you can't just have a good resume. You do kind of need to have that license at the very end, whether you like that or not.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it comes down to. And the I think timeline that my company kind of saw it as was after about 5 years, that they kind of start not really requesting it of you, not being like, hey, just checking in monthly basis now, like where's it at? Like what are you doing? Like they didn't breathe down your neck per se, but it was kind of understood that with the current requirements of like 4 years under a licensed engineer, well, if you've been at the company for 5 years, then hopefully you've had that time to actually effectively be underneath the engineer for that amount of time. And then at that point, you've reached the point where the where do you see yourself in 5 years question during your interview has now taken effect, right? And
Right.
now they're wondering, so do you actually want to be an engineer still, right? Do you still want to be the one doing that kind of work, or do you want to kind of branch separately, like to management? Because if you do want to still be doing that engineering work, you want to be the licensed engineer, then you need to have the license. Sorry, yeah, by definition, right?
Right.
So it's a logical like time for them to kind of check in and be like, hey,
Yeah.
so is this something that you want to do for your career? If so, here's kind of what we have at our disposal. But yes, you do have to kind of
Yeah.
actively pursue
And
the test.
after 4 or 5 years, you've seen enough, done enough,
Mhm.
and you've kind of had more than enough opportunity to swirl around some different projects and different people. And if you
Hmm.
wanted to go a different direction, you probably would have um, taken different actions along the way. But since you haven't, that's the trajectory, and that's the natural next step.
Yep.
So without much prompting, you were already thinking in that direction, probably for
Yeah.
years.
Yeah. So like I said, without the kind of like constant reminder, it was more of just kind of an understanding of, okay, so I've been here for about the reasonable amount of time, and now it's just kind of logically come up like, hey, for future work, if I want to do these other projects, if I want to also be, put it as nicely as possible, a desirable candidate for future work as we kind of like restaff different projects and, your name comes up for a project, do you want that manager to pull you in? Well, if you don't have the license,
Mm,
you will need to be underneath someone else who will then be able to be kind of that final stamping engineer. If you do have the license, then you can possibly be in a project that doesn't require as many people, where you have a bit more control and you get the final say. You can stamp the project and you don't have to kind of go through that other step of, hey, present my work to someone who does have the license,
right.
right? It simplifies everything, and then you can kind of put yourself in that next step to start performing with a license. And obviously, there's still learning to be done when you do get the license, right?
Of
But
course, yeah.
you gotta get over that hump, and then you can start learning how to best use it and like where you'll actually need it in the first place too, because we have a lot of different work in different states, and obviously it really depends on where you're actually working and where you're going to use it. So all those
Right.
little factors.
Yeah, a lot of nuance there. So once you decided to get serious, um, how did you think about what to do next? Like what was kind of like your action plan, and what did you research, or how did you go about that? Because I think there's a lot of information out there and people have different ways of gathering it and choosing a path. So I'm curious to hear what your path was.
Yeah, I initially, well, I asked immediate members of my company, those who I knew had also either taken the test recently or were licensed. And if I'm being honest, those who were like 10 plus years older than me, at that point, to be completely honest, that the process had changed, right? Like within that 10 years, the requirements, the amount of time that you needed to take in order to take it had changed. And a lot of those people who would give feedback about the daunting PE test were the ones who were talking about wheeling in a cart of books to this destination that was an hour away from where they lived, for that
Right.
one magical day that will always remain in infamy. And you're like, I feel inspired, but that had completely changed. So it was useful to hear about those experiences to kind of be like, okay, this is going to be a serious process. But it was a lot more of the recent ones who were maybe like 5 years within my age that had maybe attempted it recently or who are currently studying that had the more useful feedback of, oh, hey, I'm doing like a night program that I found with like nearby our office, like near
Mm,
the local college, because they would do for me at the time, our office was really close to Portland State University. And so they had, obviously, there were students there who were practicing for their FE, but then with other programs, they had some night classes for PE review classes. So some of those folks were jumping into them. They said, oh, that works pretty well. And then the pandemic happened, and that became somewhat
mm,
irrelevant for a while.
wow.
And I moved away for a bit too. So I thought about maybe doing something like that in the beginning because I'd heard some people had success with it. But then a lot of that changed and my availability changed and my location changed. And uh, what those folks were doing who were going to those classes, the main thing that I took away from it too was that they had someone they were going with. They weren't going to it on their own. They were going to
Mm,
it with someone else. Typically, that was someone who was at the office too. So, you finish your workday together, you march out. And that was the
yeah.
whole accountability thing. Accountability
Yeah.
is what I took away from that, which is when as I was trying to figure out the best time to study for my PE, I recalled that I had roped a friend into the FE process, and I kind of did that again for making the PE as painless as possible, so I could make sure that we could both kind of see it through to a passing grade, which, as I mentioned to you before, he was taking a different test, but still we had a common enough goal that we
Right.
wanted to pursue together.
Yeah, I think that really illustrates the value of an accountability partner where it doesn't even necessarily have to be a study partner. It's not like you guys were putting in hours together working on problems. Maybe you got a little bit of technical support from each other. But more than
Hmm.
anything else, it was just going through the process side by side and saying, we have a similar goal. Like you said, it's a common goal. It's not the exact same exam, but it takes, roughly the same amount of time and preparation and just having somebody who can kind of hold your feet to the fire and say, how much did you do last week? Oh, I was traveling, I missed XYZ and I got to
Hmm.
catch up. And it makes a huge difference. And your kind of explanation about how it was when there was a local course to be able to go with a colleague at the end of a workday as partners and just kind of go there together and study. And that's extremely powerful stuff. But when you have a pandemic and you're in a new place and everything changes, it's like, now what?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And for the two of us too, the other I think thing that was important enough is because we were still taking a mechanical test. We weren't studying the exact same materials. There was like this much overlap, right? There was
Yeah.
something, but we could also still gripe together about the reference handbook that was applicable to both of us. So that was important.
Yes.
You have to have someone that you can confide in when it comes to having frustrations about your reference handbook. But the importance of it and the familiarity with it became shared knowledge, or at least you stay in this area and I'll stay in this area. And sometimes there were cases where it was like, oh, so I don't recognize this, and they knew exactly where I
Hmm.
should look because it was a little bit of that overlap, but also it had just come up in someone else's search because you can only map the reference handbook so well. Sometimes someone else has just already done it for you. And if you don't have that person to kind of talk to about it, it's not going to come up necessarily.
Right. Yeah, it's really the practice problems that kind of expose you and force you to look in certain places. How did you find me?
Yeah. So how did I then find the actual course that I took? So the folks that I had talked to at work about who had taken it recently, your name came up as one of the other as someone who was offering practice courses or offering a full course in this case. And some other courses that also come up as I talked to people who were looking at mechanical, and then I had some friends who were looking at the chemical tests. So I kind of got a spread after looking online too of like, okay, so here are some things that exist. And I'd heard mixed things about some of the other like the PPI to pass, not to name drop with a negative on it, but that's one of the first things that'll come up when you search just like anything
Right.
PE related, right? Like, there's so much that they offer. And I had a friend who was actively taking that at the time, and the structure seemed the structure seemed okay, but when I looked more into that next bullet point I had, which was your course, it seemed like a little bit more, it seemed a little bit more open and flexible with like, hey, this is a study course, but it's going to kind of go at your pace and you kind of set the parameters on how it's going to operate, which I thought was good because I'm not like everyone else, not to say that in a weird way, but like I'm not like another candidate who's taking the PE, right? Like I watched someone else who was studying for this thing and they did do it in a very short amount of time and I
Mm.
considered them to be very knowledgeable and was unsurprised when they passed. And so I took from that, like, well, I think I'm gonna need a little bit more time, and I might, in some cases, need some hand holding or gentle reminders. And I saw that some of those other courses were you're basically enrolled kind of like those night classes. So you have
Mm.
to kind of, if you don't make these, then you don't submit your work, you like don't get credit. And I didn't look too much more into it after that because I also heard that in some cases, once your course was completed, it vanished. It was gone. I was like, that's not
Right.
how I like to
As a
spend.
timeline or something, it's going to
Yeah,
expire.
which is, on the one hand, that's very good for saying, all right, well, once you're done with it, you're taking the test. You have to. Like that is
Right.
one way to have the necessity to take the exam right after the course, but at the same time, things happen. And as obviously I went through my study process, I had at least, one little hiccup that pushed me off of my original trajectory by like a month. And
Mm-hmm.
if I had been on one of those courses at the time, I would have had to pay money to either extend my resources or actually don't even know what the other options
Well,
were
you
at
would
the
have just
time. Yeah.
missed that content, and then you
Hmm.
would have been scrambling to try to catch up on that while still progressing at the right speed with the new material.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminds me of school, right? Like we have this kind of, I'm an idealist, so I like to think about mastery learning as an alternative to traditional school, where you have a semester or you have a year, and there's a set curriculum, and everybody does the same thing at the same time. And how could that ever work for 20 or 30 kids in a room? Some are going to go faster than others. Some come in
Right.
with a better background. Some are getting more or different support at home. And some just have different learning modalities where they struggle to pay attention in a classroom. There's 100 different, reasons why students can have their own path. And with mastery learning or like the Khan Academy type model, you don't progress to the next level until you prove that you know it at the level that you're at. So it's not about the time that you spend, it's about the depth and the quality of the learning at that level. And then you're welcome to proceed to the next step. So that's why I always felt strongly about having something that's self-guided, but also supported, because I don't want to just put you on a conveyor belt and say, like, okay, fend for yourself. It's more like this is the process to go through, but you control the speed, and I'm here for questions. And you and I had probably 4 or 5 chats along the way at different, kind of intervals throughout your
Right.
process.
Because
And
I said I wanted to have them, and you said, okay, that's my schedule's available for that.
it,
And that's
it,
exactly what I was looking for.
yeah, and I think where that was most powerful, and you correct me if this is wrong, but at the beginning it was more or less kind of just getting you in the right direction, which you were motivated and you were doing the work, so it was all good. And then like you mentioned before, you kind of ran into a roadblock that impacted your schedule, and you lost about maybe close to a month, and then you had to pick back up on the backside of that. And I think that conversation that we had after that month was kind of a pivotal moment for you because you hit the reset button. it was getting real. You're starting to see the finish line in sight. You scheduled your date. What was going through your mind around that time?
I knew that, I mean, it's like when you're coming into the conversation expecting to be reprimanded in some sort of way. But obviously I'm coming in there being like, all right, well, lay my cards on the table. Let's see what the outside source has to say. Because obviously you're pretty familiar with the study process, not just mine in particular. You don't know all the nitty-gritty details. You do kind of rely on what I tell you. So let's be honest about it. But I've obviously at that point had made my goals pretty clear on when I wanted to take it, and was also very bluntly saying, yeah, I'm not taking it when I wanted to. But I haven't paid for it yet, so we're not having a different conversation right now. There's a
Right.
little less money involved in that at that point. But I am kind of looking like, hey, yeah, I messed up. What do you think is the right thing to do? And I mean, you pulled the final card, which was, well, sounds like you gotta schedule it now. You're like, yeah, I guess you're right. And it was exactly what I needed to hear because I was not, up to that point, I had not wanted to pay the money to find out when I could take the test, was the actual answer. I wanted to take it. I just didn't want to pay money and find out when, but it was fortunate I did when I did. I said by like the end of the week after that conversation, I would look into it. And I'm glad I did because then I found out what was available and when, which ended up structuring, I guess, most of my January schedule. Because then I also, yes, immediately after that, I also put my friend's feet to the fire and said,
Mm.
guess who just, scheduled their test? And he had to scramble then to also do that because not like he was waiting on me, but we're a team, and found that his availability was very different because he was in a different spot. So it was a good reminder that yeah, you can wait a little bit, but can't wait forever. So finally making that last commitment was good. Because obviously I was hesitant leading up to that process of really pulling the trigger on selecting a date because I was always kind of using that as a, well, if something goes wrong or I don't feel 100%, it's not scheduled.
Right.
So it's
You can always push back, you can
I'll
wait,
push
you
a little
can do a
bit.
little more. Right.
Yeah.
And that focused you in January and kind of got you to do the remaining work, which, you weren't really off track. It was just a matter of like closing it out and kind of getting that last bit of work. And that's a tough time because by that point you're tired, your motivation can be in all kinds of different places. And yeah, just need that extra push to kind of get to the finish line. And then how about the exam itself and or maybe even like the final stretch leading up to the exam and then taking the exam? What surprised you there? What stood out to you there?
Yeah, let's start before. So before the exam, I think things were feeling pretty good. So I did the kind of similar goals we had talked about. I don't think it was like the last meeting before, but we you talked about leading up to the exam, like, okay, you'll take the two practice courses that you have, like the two sample practice tests, and then you recommended also getting one from the website, right? Getting one from NCES as
Hmm.
well. And so I did those. I got creative where I kind of sandwiched the NCES one in between the two that you had. Looking back, I don't know if that was the right thing to do or not. That's what I did. But the other one, I also found another one that a coworker had sent me, and I admit I don't fully remember where it was from, and it was definitely an older test because
Mm.
it was saying you find the answer to this in this book. So again, it's like I used it for what it was. Like it was
Yeah.
another way to tackle like problems like, can I answer this? Can I not? And through those varying types of exams, I found things that I felt confident in and others that I thought, whoa, I hate that. But it was good. It was good to see all of them. And it was important, definitely, to see them all when I did, because I took those, I think I finished my last practice exam officially like within a week before the exam itself. So I had a little bit more time to maybe identify a few of those questionable areas and go back to them, whether that was like the problems I really didn't like explicitly or the general ideas. So I had at least like, that less than a week to deep dive into some of those in particular. And it wasn't like I was finishing the practice exam the night before because that would obviously be pretty terrible.
Right.
But I'm glad I did do the NCES practice one as well because on the one hand, the questions that you had picked out, I knew the shortcuts from all the practice I'd done with your practice problems, and I knew some of the other things to look out for as a result of that too, which helped me in a lot of ways on those NCES ones. And the NCES ones offered different types of questions in ways that I was like, that's unique. So I'm glad I saw them phrase it this way because in the end, it is, of course, their language that will dictate the actual exam. Whether or not that was fully reflective on the exam day, it came to show that, there are many different ways to write a similar problem. And whether you like it or not, you gotta be ready for that type. So
Right.
I guess the ultimate, just like seeing a bunch of different exam questions was good, as I had been prepped beforehand to do as many problems as you can. Yeah, pretty true. But finally taking them and timing a little bit was good. Though I wasn't focusing too much at the very end on the time itself because I found in kind of like one of my first exams, when it was one of your practice exams, that my timing was okay, and it was more of the percentage I was getting correct was what I was more concerned about. So I was like,
Right.
okay, I'm gonna focus less on the time and let's go for quality. Let's see if I can
Yes.
actually finally start answering these ones correctly. And it got a little bit better. And that's why I was still a little bit uncertain on how the exam day was going to go on that regard. But I was
Right.
like, it's at least I can see an improvement. So let's hope that just continues onto the day of the exam.
Yeah, I really want to stress that point for folks that are listening. I think that's a great adjustment that you made when you're starting to think about timing. You're getting close to the end of your study process. You know that you have to do 80 problems in 8 hours, and you're thinking, okay, 6 minutes a problem on average. I think there's a lot of folks that want to be hitting that 6 minute mark consistently and really need to be reminded that there's going to be some problems that take you longer. That's okay. There's going to be some problems that take you considerably less time. We're shooting for an average of 6 minutes, so it's okay if some of them are longer, as long as the average works out. And when you're studying, even if you're getting close to the end of your process, you're still potentially going to average more than 6 minutes a problem, and that's okay because you're still learning, you're still studying. You don't have to be a finished product, you don't have to be perfect. And even when you get to your exam day, you're not going to be perfect. That's okay, that's expected. And I think, just being reminded, there's a lot of folks who literally start studying for the PE exam and want to be able to do problems in 6 minutes a piece and get frustrated when they can't. And that is perfectionism at its best, where you just can't get going. So the fact that you kind of brought the clock, you didn't get too involved with the clock in the early stages, which is right. You started to get it involved later, closer to the end, but you didn't obsess over it, and you focused on depth and quality, and you sort of let the time take care of itself, and it worked out for you.
Yeah. And I think I kind of mentioned that to you in the beginning too, that I was someone who was concerned about that time aspect. I notoriously had not been someone who was like really good at not pacing myself per se, but I would be there at the very end of a test for school. I would take my time. I would take all the time I needed because I usually just went pretty long on exams. The only one I could remember finishing in a reasonable amount of time in recent years was the FE. So hey,
Hmm.
there's that. But
Well, there's a
that's
reason why you're an engineer too.
I guess. And it was, yeah, so it was a realization that once I was doing the problems, that the focus needed to be put on the problems themselves and not the time, because sometimes when I incorporated the clock too much, I would get just a little bit too crazy, focused on the like, oh, a minute left if I try to make this out.
Yeah.
It's like you're so distracted by the time itself that you stop focusing on the problem. At least that was a problem for me. So yes, I put less emphasis on it in the end. And yes, spoiler alert, jumping to the exam day, I did not have a problem with the time, which I was like, of all things, again, yeah, to take away from it, I was happily surprised that I did not have to worry about like the last minutes, or I didn't have to worry about like that last flashing time that, hey, you better get a question answered for
Yeah,
all
get
these
an get an answer
questions,
down for any
otherwise
blanks. Like, no, I'm
you're gonna
not
get
going to stress
nothing.
the end.
So yeah, that actually did end up working well. I finished I wrote this down. I finished the morning session with, was it 30 to 60 minutes? I took a little bit of time to circle back on a few things. So I could have finished with 60 minutes on the morning section, which I
Wow.
think, yeah, old me, pat myself on the back. Like that is unheard of from my history of exam taking. And then I finished the afternoon section with about 30 minutes. So I was
Great.
very comfortable with the time, which was again quite a shock, but I guess it was again just kind of proof of like that was where my focus for prep was, I think, better spent on the problems themselves and not the whole like 6 minutes, 6 minutes, like chop
Right.
chop.
That's perfect. And what uh what percentage of the problems out of 40 problems in the morning and afternoon did you circle back on? Did you flag and go back to versus, kind of just do the first time through and not even relook at?
I think, let's see, I want to say that for the morning, I think I flagged like five of them to go back to. In the afternoon, maybe it was like 10.
Okay.
And I know without, because we can't talk about the problems in particular, I can't say, yeah, what they were made up of. They were not calculation problems. Is that legal? Can I can I say the types that I circled back on? Hmm. I was confident about the ones that I answered, and the ones that I didn't answer were kind of ones that I looked at. Nope. And I'm going to come back to that because
Right,
they
right,
they were much more in that category of I'm probably going to guess on this one. I'll give it a little bit more time. But in the meantime, it's not worth me stressing over. I've
right,
I've done the first pass and I have thoughts about this, which I cannot say out loud like during the exam test room, but I'm going to come back to those later and we will give them a fair shake. So
right,
I'm not going to try to waste my time on it, and whether or not that actually impacted how much time I had left later, a little unclear. But yeah, so mostly they fell into that category where it's like I'll maybe do a little bit more like work once I know I have the time to do that. Once I
right.
know that that's not going to be a factor because yes, I will 100% guess on these if I need to, but I'd prefer to
To
start
have
through the
some
other ones
to think
first.
about them a bit more, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that allows you to preserve your cognitive bandwidth for as long as possible, as deep as possible into the exam, doing problems that you pretty quickly can figure out how to do and working through them and closing them out. And then you don't need to return to those. So now you've only got these 5 or 10 to go back to for each section. And you can do that comfortably at your own pace, knowing that you've got an hour to work with. And, you probably wouldn't even be able to spend the hour if you wanted to, because there's not that much to think about. You might end up guessing on some of those.
Yeah.
And you kind of make your peace with that. You're like, all right, one or two don't make sense. I'm flipping a coin between the other two. But I already know I got 30 that I feel pretty good about. If you're 90% confident in 30 questions, you've got 27, probably. You don't know for sure, but
Hmm.
then out of the last 10, maybe you get three or four, and we're starting to get up to everybody wants to know what's a passing score. We
I
won't be able to
yeah.
tell anyone that, but the point being you've done the best that you can and you're willing to let it go from there, and you just walk out of there. Maybe not. So tell me, like, how confident were you leaving versus like, because people go through a
This
lot after they
is
walk
yeah.
out of the exam room.
Well, it kind of goes nicely into the what is the passing score, and yeah, so how did you feel? Because obviously people want to know how did you feel? 8-hour test. Like, how did you
Right.
feel? I was like, do you really want to know how I felt after that test? I felt awful. Like I did not feel great. My friend who had taken it like a week before, it's like, oh, I think it went okay. Like, and that's like a pretty regular thing to say. Like, oh, I did my best. I think it went all right. At a certain point, I felt during the test that I was like, I I keep getting like these kinds of questions, which I can't, fully define, but I keep getting certain questions that I'm answering, and I think I've hit the number where I don't pass, but there is no number that defines a pass versus no pass at the time. And it all depends on like, things that happen later. So, I mean, I started to not feel so great during the test, but I kept going and I came out like, I mean, some of them yeah, I definitely got those and others were not. And so I again just started focusing on the ones that I felt that I didn't do well. The ones that really frustrated me where I was like, how would I have studied for that? That ruined it for me. And I just
Mm,
like I've never walked out of a test, feeling like that when the the score and the pass is so unclear that I was like, okay, well then this must mean that I probably didn't pass. Like maybe by the grace of random guessing, I did okay, but I'm going to assume that this may not have gone well. And obviously, it was a rough week to have to wait that long to get the results back, and then to discover that I did pass. And I was like, I was admittedly very surprised. Like I phrased it where when I took the FE after I took that one, I was like, okay, if I didn't pass that one, I'll be surprised because I felt pretty confident about that one. This one was the opposite. I was like, okay, if I pass that, it's possible, but I'll be kind of surprised.
So you were less than 50%. You were feeling
I
like
was I was definitely on the
30,
lower
40
end.
kind of. Yeah.
And it was because just had been enough of these questions that I just didn't feel super confident about. But again, it's like multiple choice, and I kept going back to that, like, well, what is a passing grade? No one knows what a passing grade is. So
Right.
I was kind of trying to compare to something that wasn't real. And I
Right.
still, of course, that's the most frustrating thing too. I don't know what it was. I still won't know and never
You'll
will.
never know. Yeah, we'll
So
never know.
I want my due responses. I want to know what I did poorly on and what I did, but maybe I don't.
Well, to
So
me, to me, that's a mark of an engineer that I would want to work with, right? Is somebody who, after the project is done, after the design is finished, it's installed, like everybody's moving on to the next thing, but the analytical mind doesn't rest. It
mhm,
says, what was the answer to that? Or is there a different way to think about that? Like we're always going to be working the problem. And I think that's part of why we do what we do. And
yeah.
that's a beautiful thing about engineering. It's just that mindset keeps going.
hmm So I,
Um,
I I pretty much, yeah, like I tortured myself, not like, too explicitly, but like I was not very confident after the
wow.
exam. And I obviously was telling most people, you included, like, that didn't go well. That was an expensive practice problem, like, you know what I mean? And obviously I didn't need to do that, but that's just how I felt and I dwelled on it. So in the end, yeah, I didn't need to beat myself up so much about it because I hadn't gotten the answers yet. I hadn't gotten the results,
Right.
and you don't know until you get that answer back. And even yeah, knowing whether or not you passed or failed, you don't know if that is even going to fully scratch the itch of like here's your if you fail, you get like a little bit of a breakdown, but it still doesn't
Yeah.
tell you like, oh, well, that's because you didn't put a five at the end of this answer, and that's why you got it
Right.
wrong.
It's very
So
limited
yeah,
feedback.
so yeah, I'm very conflicted still on how to feel about everything afterwards because I don't know what the proper response is. It's such a weird feeling for a test that you just kind of get that pass fail
Yeah.
notification and that's it.
It's also kind of a weird thing in the first place that there would be a binary assessment. I mean, you would never look at a colleague or somebody that you work with that way and say like, okay, I'm going to partner up with this person and work on a project and, they're either great or terrible. It's like, no, and life isn't like that, right? Somebody has
hmm
certain skills and things that they're really good at. They have gaps and, areas that they're weaker in or things that they're more or less experienced in. And what is a professional engineer? It's somebody who knows enough to have passed this exam and has enough of the right experience, but not all professional engineers are built the same. So maybe some people take a really targeted approach, like my program focuses you on like kind of the most important things, and I just hammer on those and we go as deep as possible on those core ideas. But other people might take more of a scratch and claw approach where they try to hit the tops of the waves and like kind of lightly hit a broad number of topics and hope that they somehow cobble together enough small pieces. And that's like a game of inches. So you can play it that way, or you can try to go right down the middle. And there's no wrong way to conduct your studying. There's no wrong way to approach your career. Um, but obviously, deeper is better and broader is better. So you kind of have to pick the balance between the two that makes sense for the time that you have. I
Yeah.
wanted to circle back on something else that you said, which I think is really common feedback for folks as they're taking the exam and then reflecting on it after, is that you don't know how you're doing while you're in there. And if you have a good strategy psychologically, you can't spend too much time worrying about that in the moment. You have to focus on solving the problems so that you can do your best. So you do that. Um, with whatever level of success you do. And then after the fact, then you can no longer influence the result. You walk out of the exam room And now you have nothing but time for several days until the result comes to think about what you could have done better. To your point, like, whoa, what is there any way I could have studied for that problem?
Right.
Who
Nope.
knows,
Probably
right?
not. Yeah.
And yeah, and then you kind of try to project whether it's going to go your way or not. And it's funny from my perspective because from having multiple conversations with you, I had a high level of confidence that you would be successful. Um, and that comes out of a few different things. It's your conscientiousness and the way that you approach the study process, your honesty and openness about when it is or isn't going well, and what you think has to change to fix it, and your technical competency and the questions that you asked in that realm. So I felt great about it, but that doesn't necessarily. So I guess what I'm getting at is for candidates that are listening is that the way you feel about what's going on is not always a helpful or objective or accurate assessment of whether you're on track and whether it's going to work out or not. But what I never want to do is give you just a pat on the back and say, no, you're good. Don't worry about it. Because if
Mhm.
I do that, let's suppose, the analogy, like you can be 3 feet from gold. So maybe you've done, 99 hours of work and it was something that was going to happen in that 100th hour that a light was going to go off and that's going to convert one problem for you. And that one problem is going to be the difference between passing and failing. And because I told you don't worry about it, you just took your foot off the gas. But instead, I always push for more and say, you know what? You've got a week left. Maybe you could look at a few things again. Maybe there's something at the beginning that you might have forgot. Maybe there's some supporting topic that you could have a second look at, and that could be a difference maker for you. The only time I would never do that is if you're like 24 or 48 hours from your exam, because you don't need that extra stress. So then I just
Right.
say rest and relax and just try to show up fresh.
And there were definitely things on the exam, or should I say, there were definitely areas that I studied for where I was like, yes, this is where I'm most confident in, and I'm like, this, nothing will get past me. And it's true because on the exam there was none of that, and you're like, hmm, great, and you leave feeling frustrated from that too. And then there's of course one little thing where you maybe saw it like once, and you think, yeah, if only I'd known. So, but it's going to be like that regardless.
Right.
And so the obviously, yeah, just that's why I felt the amount of time I spent was necessary. And then seeing just the very different kind of practice exams to hopefully flush out any chances of like those nuances. And I think I mentioned this one to you too, in some of the like practice exams, like for the NCES one, like when they'll give you like the solutions for them too, because obviously you want to look at the solutions to make sure you're doing them right. And in some cases, I don't know if it was just that version or what, but sometimes they like their solutions are very condensed or they're not very clear.
They're not
And
very generous. It's like three
yeah,
lines and you're
exactly.
like, it's no
And
picture.
And so in some cases, yeah, I think I told you I was having to like decipher some of their solutions, which in a lot of cases it was like, okay, that's pretty clear. But if they're not actually explaining like where this number comes from, then you start having to be like, I have to do work to figure out their solutions, which is, I guess that's a part of the practice, isn't it? But in other cases, I recognized certain like shortcuts. I recognized certain assumptions that I was able to make because of like the practice problems that I'd done through your course. And I was like, okay, so that almost served as like my legend to better decipher their solutions, which is a very weird thing to say out loud, but it's true. That's kind of how
Yeah.
I was working through it at the very end, and at least it helped uh kind of better parse through some of those areas that were a little unclear. So I guess that kind of just proved that, yeah, this was a better way for me to kind of approach problems, or at least like the work that I had done through your course up to that point was clearly doing something right because I was able to much better understand what kind of these random numbers were that NCES thought was very obvious solutions, which is
Yeah.
not.
Right. Not obvious at all. And yeah, I can definitely relate to that personally because I know at the beginning of my process going through some of these study materials, I would just be like, I got no idea what's going on. And I like to think I pay attention to things and, pretty technical, but yeah, a lot of stuff that needed to be built up during that process. And yeah, you just can't get through this thing without thinking. I think people have a fantasy that they're going to be so prepared and they're going to study so well that the exam is going to be a cakewalk. And even if you're very well prepared, you're still going to have to think in there. There's just no way around it. And there shouldn't be because we want engineers to have the strongest critical thinking skills and the ability to use them. So that means while it's an interesting challenge for folks to go through, it's probably a pretty good exam. That's kind of how I look at it.
Mhm.
So what's next for you? Is this milestone mean anything in terms of your career coming up right away or sometime this year, or what's going to be happening next?
Goals within this year. I have admittedly dragged my feet a little bit. I'm off track again. Uh-oh. On taking that exam and now actually applying it to get the license. So
Oh, the
I've got
paperwork portion, of
yeah,
course.
the real fun stuff. Yeah,
Hmm.
the exam part that was easy. Now comes the hard part. Uh, but yeah, so hopefully get all that wrapped up within the oh shoot, should I make a public commitment like first half of this year? That's far enough away, right? Like
You got to be careful. There might be 12
I
people
know,
that listen
I
to this.
know.
They're gonna follow up with you.
So yeah, the goal is to kind of have that uh push through at some point this year so that I can hopefully get that license within the year, and then that's hopefully going to lead to like a work promotion by actually having that license, working on getting the exam reimbursed through my work as we speak. So that's the first milestone. That was the one perk that I could rely on, and I'd like to see that followed through, please. Um, but then then hopefully that will go into effect within the year, and I know we've got more projects on the horizon, and my boss will start talking to me more about what that means to have like a license, and then of course tackling like if I have it in the right states or where I need to get it in certain states, because where I currently live is not where I'm doing work for. So yeah,
Right.
that's
Yes,
important.
you may want to get licensed in several states
Yeah.
depending on where
So
the projects are going to be.
yes, look into to those details. So yeah, that's kind of the immediate next steps.
That's fantastic. Well, I'll be excited to see where you go next and what you get up to. Any any closing thoughts for aspiring professional engineers that are thinking about following in your footsteps that you want to leave them with from just the wisdom that you've kind of
Oh
acquired
man.
throughout this time?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as we've kind of said through this part, like going at your own pace is important, but making sure you can best define what that pace is, because just saying that, oh, you're going too fast, like I'm not that smart. I don't need to go. I'm not gonna take this in like 4 months or something. But you still have to define like what does success mean for you? Obviously, is most likely going to be passing the PE exam, but also, yeah, what is that process? Because by the end, I found myself with a pretty study schedule that was not too aggressive, but it was enough time that I felt comfortable and confident, and then readjusted as necessary. But it required constant reflection and
Right.
constant check-ins to see like if that was the right thing for me. So it was very, very hands-on. There was no coasting through the process. So you definitely, when I knew I committed to it, it was, yep, it was time to study. And then let's see, by the time it came to take the exam, I was admittedly looking online. There's like subreddits, for people taking the PE exam too. And in some cases I was just curious, like, okay, because I was again wrapped up in the numbers, like what do I think I need to get in order to pass? And people were throwing out numbers they got on like practice exams, and then they
Mm.
took the test and they passed. So you're like, all right, so I'm not hitting those numbers for my practice exams. Uh, I don't think I should be taking this test then. And the reality was, obviously, that became slightly irrelevant because that was their experience and that was their test. So there's only so much that you can take from other people's experiences of like, oh, well, I don't know, I got an 80% and you should probably be over like a 75 if you want to take the exam. Eh, it really depends, yeah, on like how you're feeling and how best prepped you are for the day. And it's not even going to be the same exact PE exam the day of. So it really, you pull in some like useful outside information to help you study. But when it comes to some of those specifics on like, yeah, are you hitting this mark or whatnot? It's like, yeah, how do you feel about it? Really
Yeah.
became super, super important. And it's like blocking some of that outside noise. You got to pick and choose your battles on what you let influence you for the test prep process, because it can really help and hinder you at the same time. And yeah, it obviously became pretty impactful to me like in the last few days, but I had to be really careful with yeah, how much I let that impact me of like, okay, am I go or no go? It's the 20 or
Right.
48-hour window before you can like cancel or postpone a test. And you got to be, yeah, you got to be careful that you don't just like in the last seconds be like, I don't think I'm gonna do this because people online are saying that I'm not getting the right score to take the
Right.
exam.
Don't fumble on the 1 yard line. Just
Hmm.
drive it in, finish it.
Yeah, of
Yeah, those are great takeaways. That's perfect. That's awesome, man. Thank you so much for coming on. This was fantastic.
course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Mechanical PE Exam Prep Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review to help other engineers find the podcast. And if you're looking for a program that will help you pass the PE exam, check out the full access bundle available at mechanicalpeexamprep.com and feel free to reach out with any questions. I would be honored to be your guide on the journey to becoming a professional engineer.